Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning meeting about crisis management and continuation planning, and some other interesting things about NATO, I'm hoping. I'm going to have, as usual, we will have a question and answer session at the end. So if you have any questions for David, you can write them in the chat, and I will help you ask them to him at the end of the presentation. But now I hand over to David. Welcome.
Thank you, Johanna. So, welcome everyone to this morning meeting of the Faculty of Medicine, where we will talk a bit about international security and the preparedness for crisis. The work that we are doing at the Faculty of Medicine and a bit about Lund University in general. And I really look forward to having questions on this very timely and extremely interesting field. Afterwards, so please write a lot of questions in the chat. I only have 10 slides. I really hope to have a good Q&A session afterwards. So the theme here is building a crisis resilient faculty. Today, the question is how to have this, the cozy house cat that Sweden is where in times of international stability and peace, and how to transform that one into sometimes being a defensive lion. And so let's see if I can see my own slides. The Zoom offers so many bars that I hardly see my own text. Yeah. So why are we doing this now? I don't think that any of you have really missed that we have now entered an era of, again, intensified strategic competition between multiple world powers. So many people have said that this is like a Cold War, like the Cold War that we had, remember, after 1945 up until 1990, but it's a difference. It's like the Cold War, but first of all, it's a multipolar situation. In the Cold War, we had a big Eastern Bloc and a big Western Bloc. But in this case, we have at least 3 very major players on the international arena, all in competition with each other, and then a number of other middle-sized players, like the BRICS countries, that are also, to some degree, in competition with the other larger players and smaller players. We're also much more interconnected, meaning that we don't have any strict walls of trade or information flow between these different competing powers, which is a big difference. If you compare it to the Cold War, we are very much more interconnected. And Sweden is also, if you compare to the Cold War, much more connected through different alliances. We have the EU to start with, and as from around today, we also have NATO. The situation is also quite volatile because of things that were not really there during the Cold War. We have climate disruption, the climate change. So we know that even if we are now talking a bit about international politics and the different crises and challenges that might mean for Lund University, we will also have things that do not have much to do, really, as they're not, at least not consequences of politics. They could rather be consequences as absence of policy, That's the changes in climate and the heat waves and the rains that you could expect in the future. It's another reason to plan for a future which contain more crisis and which is more volatile than before. Another difference is that we have considerable technical acceleration in many, many fields. And I think we are really part of this acceleration. Artificial intelligence is, of course, what you all think about when I talk about technical acceleration, that things develop faster and faster, but also biotechnology is a big part of this. And that means that it's very, very difficult to predict the future. So we have to some extent plan for the very unknown. So this competition that I mentioned in the new multipolar world order, it largely plays out in the gray zone between war and peace. Cyber attacks is a perfect example of this. We now had very recent examples, problems with the Primula, the HR systems, part of this gray zone conflict. And the gray zone between war and peace is, of course, dominated by things like that: cyber disruption, data theft. For example, you maybe now saw in the papers that the hack to Sophiahemmet in Stockholm, they have now put out the information from multiple patients on the darknet. And that's, of course, a way. Why is this being done? Well, it's, of course, to cause confusion and disruption among your enemies, and also to try to create polarity in the society that you are targeting to some extent. And that's why, again, universities come in, because we are part of the government structure. We are part of a society where government institutions, such as a university, creates trust and is an important part of the function of the society. That's why also universities, apart from hospitals, could be an interesting target for this. Then, of course, we have the economic influence and coercion. That's another way of doing race of warfare, embargoes. We are, of course, the EU is, of course, also an actor in this. We have a number of embargoes against other countries, and they have embargoes against us. And you can also use pressure individual companies in many ways to do a coercion against countries which you are in competition with. And then we have disinformation, information operations. That has been talked quite a lot about, as you know, for example, the LVU campaign against Swedish social services. So scientists, universities have been critical and so far easy targets for gray zone campaigns, if you look throughout the democratic world. And why is it so? Well, it is probably a combination of the fact that academic institutions are by tradition open and should be as open as possible. But at the same time, academic institutions contain a lot of interesting things, especially expertise and plans for innovation in what is called strategic technology today in the world of international security. And also medicine and the Faculty of Medicine, which you would otherwise think is really a place of peace and that should not be touched by this, is a very tempting target in such a respect. So I'm just trying to highlight how this is seen by some of the major players. So I happen to be the member that Lund University has in NATO's Science and Technology Organization, where I'm part of a group looking at biotech. And NATO has singled out several of the fields that we actually work with at the Faculty of Medicine as areas that are of extreme importance for future conflict. And you should know that the NATO STO works to some extent with military applications, but also a lot of civil defense applications. No matter what, things like this, bioengineering and genetics, bioinformatics are supposed to have very high impact in the near future. And interestingly enough, if you look at NATO's assessment of different world powers' competence in this, how far they have progressed, it turns out that they have actually graded China. NATO has graded China as being ahead of us here, being ahead of the NATO countries. And that's probably, and this has been a strategy of the Chinese Communist Party for a long time. So this is when they released the Plan Made in China 2025, there was a big national effort on biotech. So we might even be behind in some of these fields. No, nevertheless, we could have interesting things, and interesting data for other actors. And if you look at Russia, the third major, very disruptive power here, they have been aware of this for quite a long time. So this is from a Nature article in 2015, when information leaked out that the FSB had to review all biology papers before sent to a journal from the Moscow State University. Just showing you that things in molecular biology actually are and could be of strategic value. How has Sweden reacted to this? This climate where universities are a critical sensitivity? Well, this is the most recent action in this case. So there was one of these government reviews, one where there was actually a very, very fast review done by a single person. high-level official called Peter Egart, who looked at the security arrangements of Swedish universities, and where he actually highlights again that this is interesting for foreign powers to look at, to try to influence to some extent, and also to get information, especially for innovation. And this review actually showed that there was a big difference in Swedish universities, how we had handled securities, but they're saying that overall, there are lots of things to be improved. And one consequence of this is a suggestion that this most probably will go through, that any university that somehow works with sensitive data and sensitive information from a national security perspective, there the vice chancellor and the head of the board has to have a security classification. And that is very new, and no one has objected to this, and that has certain consequences. But as the atmosphere is today, no one has really objected to this. Security classification 3 in this case means that yes, the vice chancellor can still be a foreign citizen, but of course not a citizen of any country. So how do we look at this from the Faculty of Medicine? I mean, we have to say that, yeah, sure, the world out there is changing in a way which is worrying. On the other hand, open science and academic freedom is extremely important for what we do. Free flow of collaboration and information is vital to develop medicine for the benefit of mankind. Anyway, so we're trying to handle this in a good way. First of all, we try to consider much more than before properly how we choose our collaboration partners for international large-scale collaborations. This is also a general effort by Lund University. There's something called GDE, the Global Dynamic Engagement Strategy, which I have mentioned to you before at these morning meetings. We have also considering disruptions in the gray zone, put much more effort on contingency planning, looking at the critical dependencies of what we do. What do we need to keep on functioning, and how should we protect that from disruptions? And then in the end, something that Lund University is doing after all is that trying to identify and securing sensitive assets. And this is a strategic choice, because if you want to make your information and your data and your staff more secure in the gray zone, you can either choose to be very careful with who you let into your campus, who works there. And that strategy, which is kind of the common thing, that's the reflex, I would say, in many ways, is to try to kind of do background checks and make sure that not everyone have access, you know. And if you've ever visited one of the many other Swedish agencies, or one of those that work in national security, you will know they have a fence, they have to register, you have to show your ID. But we don't want to become that, right? We want to be an open campus. And we have absolutely no will or any capacity to do background checks on our students and our staff. We don't want ever to get there. We want to be an open university. So this other strategy, which is much more viable, is to look at, okay, so what do we really need to protect, and create islands of security within the campus. And this is probably where Lund University is going in that respect, not to lose the open campus atmosphere, which is critical really for our international impact. So I would say a few words about the partner choices and how we operate this at the Faculty of Medicine, because there will be a slight change in how we do things. I think the general idea here is to stay then, as I just said, as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. And how do we go about this? Well, around a year ago, Lund University and also the SUHF, the Swedish University's main organization, they released a policy with a checklist for something called a global responsible engagement, or ansvarsfull internationalisering. And that checklist is very broad. It's supposed to be used by typically heads of departments or researchers who want to start a new research collaboration with international partners. But what we have done to make this operative at the Faculty of Medicine is that we have looked at this checklist, we have taken away things which are simply too broad to use For example, this checklist says that, do you work with, has a question, says, okay, do you work with a partner in a country where the government influences research? And then you score a point on the checklist, and that's supposed to be a warning sign. But I mean, we all know that if you look at the calls from the Swedish Research Council or Formas, for example, or Vinnova, many of them are directed to certain areas. So of course, even the Swedish government, they do a lot of work to direct research in certain directions. So we would ourselves be signaled on such a on one of these parameters. So we cannot have things like that on the list, because it would be, then we'll have to have warning flags for basically all collaborations that we do, even with Norway and with ourselves. No. So what we did, with the blessing of the Vice Chancellor, because I have explained that we have to have a list we can work with, is that we have set up a handling procedure for the global responsible engagement at the Faculty of Medicine, with a much easier checklist, which is up for the faculty board next week and has been vetted by the International Council of the Faculty of Medicine and by the heads of departments and so on. And this consists of a list of indicators, 6 indicator headings, where an activity or a collaboration can be flagged if it's supposed to be of risk, of substantial risks. And the first question is, of course, when to use this checklist, which will probably come out in around 10 days. First of all, we will try not to infringe on academic freedom as far as we ever can. So that means that it will never guide who you go and meet, which conferences you go to, and who you publish with, of course, if you're a researcher. But it has to do with written agreements. When the university enters a contract, an economic transaction, or when an access card is given to someone, that's when the checklist should be looked at by whoever the collaborator here at Lund University or Faculty of Medicine is, typically a PI in a research group. So the first part of the checklist has to do with democratic principles and constraints of academic freedom. It's basically, it has to do, if you work with a country which is on the EU sanctions map, and not that many countries, and they're kind of obvious, then you get a dot flagging on the first point. The second one is military use and other connections to national security agencies. That's also for other countries. Even if you do this with Denmark or Norway, there will be a flag, and that is simply because there is so much in defense activities starting up overall, and we want to keep some track of them, basically to pool our resources better. Third, risk of sensitive personal and large-scale biological data. This point is just to remind you that you really have to have, even though if you work with a country which is not on the sanction map, then it still means that you have to have all the different documents in order. If you have that, so let's say that you work with a country which is not on the sanction map, if you have, I mean, your data transfer agreement in place and your ethics permits, then there is no flag, of course. Risk of ethical dumping, this has to do with a reminder that you have to have all the permits there. If you, for example, are setting up animal experiments with a collaborator which is happening in another country, collecting data in another country. And just like point 3, if you do have all the permits and the country is not on the sanction list, then there is no flag. Personal safety, this is just a reminder that if you go to a place which is on the foreign offices list of countries where you are recommended not to go, then you better go and talk to your head of department and get your insurance policy sorted out, right? And get her or his blessing to go. And then 6 is just a reminder that if you enter a collaboration where it might be close to a patent, it's good to sort out the patent rights. And then we refer you to Lund University, to LU Innovation. If a collaboration scores positive here, it does not in any way exclude collaboration. We will probably hardly never say no to collaboration. But what happens then is that we advise you to contact the International Council at the Faculty of Medicine, MIR, and then have a discussion about the risk management of this collaboration. And if there are questions about the lists, some of these, even though we have tried to make this as simple as possible, some of the items here, indicators might be difficult to interpret, then it's just easy to give me a call, or whoever will be the Vice Dean of Internationalization in the future. Right. Then contingency planning, looking at crisis ahead. We have focused on a few areas which we think are, which we have analyzed different the vulnerabilities of the faculty, and we've come up with a number of areas which we will focus on to ensure that any crisis in the future, we will hopefully get through it quite well. It's about getting the leadership structure right. There is already a crisis plan for that approved by the faculty board. Get communications that we can use even if the internet goes down. Energy backup supply. You remember 1.5 years ago, we had the warning about deficiency in powers. We already have a crisis plan, but this has to be reviewed and set up. Of course, cyber, that's very obvious. Then we have all our big research infrastructures. If things go wrong there with the research infrastructures and biobank, we might lose investments for many, many decades ahead, and invaluable material. So it's really good, important to have plans for that. Human resources, of course, there was a risk with the Tietoevry hack, for example, that people would not get their salaries. Panned out well this time, it was solved in time, but still we have to have a look at this. And then also to single out what I call critical core activities, that is in Swedish samhällsviktig verksamhet, where some of our education programs are evidently samhällsviktig verksamhet, and they also have to be planned how they should restart as fast as possible if something happens. So my last slide here, or second but last slide, is really just there will be in the coming 1 to 2 years quite a lot of plans and communications going out, especially for those of you who work in management of our departments, but also to PIs and heads in the administration about continuity planning and contingency planning. And so I just want to show those of you who are not Swedish speaking, just highlight something which is kind of good to have with you, and that are the 3 pillars of crisis management in Sweden. They have been around since the Cold War, actually, and they're still the same. So in Swedish, they're ansvarsprincipen, likhetsprincipen, and närhetsprincipen. And if you know these, it will kind of help you to think that when something happens which is off the charts, which is unusual, then if you have a clue, if you know about these principles, you don't really need always a plan, right? So the first one is called ansvarsprincipen. It just means that, yeah, if you're the boss, let's say a research group, sure, if something happens, if there's a power cut, cyber intrusion, no matter, you are still the boss. Doesn't mean that the crisis management team will just sweep in and take over everything. You are still the boss. Until sometimes, of course, you do have to have a crisis management team, but then you will be told by your boss that you're just right now not the boss. Similarity, it means that the organizational structure should be preserved as far as possible. So, for example, if something happens at the department, the head of the department, the prefect, and the people around the prefect, they are still the ones that should handle it as far as possible. But they should also, of course, go to the dean and say, I have this event going on. And if the organization of the institution is not sufficient, then help can be gotten from central functions, right? So this aligns very well with the third principle, which is proximity. A crisis should be managed as close to its center as possible and safe, but you can ask for help. That's okay. So this all says that the structures and organizations that we have when things are as in normal, in a normal function, they should be kept as far as possible in a crisis. So to finish this off, take-home messages here, we are really trying to stay as open as possible, but as close as necessary. Try to work with de-risking. This is the EU policy against countries where the EU is in competition with. De-risking is not the same as decoupling. We still want to work with most other countries, but do it in a good way where there's a good win-win without any mutual risks. And regarding crisis management, I think a good rule is to say that better good enough and on time than perfect and too late. So we're trying to be quite fast about this contingency planning, and the plans will not be perfect. They have to be tried, exercised, and revised. Okay, that's over from me.
Okay, thank you, David. We have some questions here for you. The first one here is there a reason to believe that large infrastructures in Lund, like MAX 4 and ESS, are attractive targets for a possible aggressor?
Yes, but with I mean, I would think so. There's interesting data and interesting infrastructure, but by targets, I mean, depends, of course, on your worldview, but maybe they would be more of an interesting target to get information about and to monitor, possibly to disrupt by energy or cyber intrusions. But so yes, in that sense, I would think so. At this point.
Okay, thank you. Another question here. How about infectious diseases like COVID? What kind of collaboration does the medical faculty have with relevant EU agencies like the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control? Do you intend to be part of EU health platform run by ECDC?
I think that question should go to our virology center. I know there's lots of collaborations already going on within the EU there in that sense, and there's several activities. So yes, this is obvious that that's something we want to do, and but if I know the ECDC now with the HERA organization, it's a question about reference labs, and I have to leave that to people in virology to decide how they want to do those kinds of initiatives.
Yeah, hopefully have a new lab in Malmö soon as well. So with that. Okay, so what is the most important thing we need to do to protect ourselves?
Stay informed, I would say. Stay informed is, I think, and try to kind of be aware of what's going on and stay critical also to information. I would say that in this, I'm much more worried about cyber intrusions and disinformation than about any other things right now going on in this arena. So I think that's stay informed and be critical. Keep the debate going. I think that's important. That's really, really important. And then try to think ahead. I mean, you all know there's this MSB's lists of what you should have at home, things like that. Yes, of course, that's good. It's recommended by the government. But I think for us, especially in academia, staying informed, staying critical, try to keep calm and communicate in a scientific and sensible way if you get questions from the media. These things, I think, are super important.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So what's the main reason for NATO to have a science organization?
Oh, that's a long story. It started like many decades ago, just after like in the 50s, I think. They realized that technology is super important to compete in both the military and the civilian domain. So this was started by NATO partner countries decades ago. And it's an open organization, so we don't usually do things in the classified domain. It's like a research network, really, and covering, especially looking then at what they call the EDTs. The focus is what they call EDTs, emerging disruptive technologies, looking at technologies that might completely change the arena of international competition. So it's pretty civilian for being NATO.
Okay. I think that's the last question we had here. And it's almost 9 o'clock. So thank you, David, for coming here and letting us know more about this important field. And I'm sure we'll hear more about it, as you say, in the future. And thank you, everyone, for joining. And we'll see you again in April. Good morning.